I grew up in a small town in West Virginia. I won't share the name of the hospital where I worked, but it was a small regional medical center about 15 minutes from where I grew up. I was a nursing intern in 2021, and COVID was still an important factor in my experience. One of the biggest impacts was on the housing situation for staff. Most student nurses didn't stay in the hospital dorms due to COVID, so they rented apartments nearby. I was poor and didn't have that luxury. So I stayed in the on-call staff dormitory and drove home for the weekend since I lived so close. Still, I wanted the full nursing experience in the hospital. On my first night, I met my on-call roommate. We had chatted a little over text because the hospital had given her my phone number so we could get to know each other, which I thought was a little strange. She messaged me first and seemed nice. Meeting her in person, she was still nice, but didn't say much. She carried a privileged attitude. One time while talking, she said, "Everyone has their own on-call rooms due to a lack of staff. I did last, in rotation, and now until you joined." I was a little taken aback and didn't know what to say, so I just changed the topic and continued the conversation. I told her I lived nearby and that I'd leave for the weekend on Friday and be back on Monday morning at 6 how. She didn't say much during the weekdays. She mostly stayed with her boyfriend in his on-call room. Now for the creepy part. The first Friday, I packed my bag for the weekend and left. I came back Monday morning at 6 Maus, just like I said I would. I didn't have my first shift until 10 Chaus, so I went back to sleep. I had a thick memory foam mattress in the dorm, and after lying down for about 10 minutes, I felt the edge of the bed indent. I didn't move. I waited a minute, barely processing what was happening because I was so tired. Then the mattress went back up. That's when it hit me. Someone had leaned on my bed. I turned around and saw her facing the wall, presumably sleeping. So I went back to sleep. The next weekend, I left again and returned at the same time. Again, I wanted more sleep. Moments after lying down, I felt the mattress indent again. But this time, it wasn't just the edge. The whole side sagged and someone was sitting next to me. I didn't move. I lay there frozen. And then I heard them get up. My bed was very high. In fact, I needed a step stool to climb onto it. And I heard them jump off. I held my breath, then looked over. She was again lying on her bed facing the wall. I didn't know what to think. Was I hallucinating from lack of sleep? Was it sleep paralysis? It couldn't be. I could still move. Could someone have gotten into my room? Impossible. We were the only ones with key cards. I decided I must be extremely tired and just imagining things. So, I went back to sleep. When Monday came around, I was really nervous. I walked in and saw her lying down facing my bed. She was asleep, so I climbed into bed and tried to sleep as well. 5 minutes later, I felt my bed indent again. I squeezed my eyes shut, felt someone sit next to me, and braced myself to turn around. Then I felt a hand on the back of my neck. My heart sank. I thought I was going to pass out. I didn't move a muscle. They didn't squeeze. They just held my neck. What felt like hours later, I felt them finally get off my bed. I still didn't move. I stayed frozen for a few more moments, terrified, then turned around. She was facing the wall, sleeping, but I didn't care. I left the room immediately and called my mom. I didn't go to my shift. I told my mom everything, and she reported it to the hospital administration. I was allowed to switch on-call rooms, thank God. They asked if I wanted to involve the police, but I said no. There wasn't actual proof she had done anything. I just asked them not to give her another roommate. After unpacking in my new room, I remembered a few things. She had once told me that she had a previous roommate who didn't stay long, but she never said why. I also remembered one day she opened a locked drawer in the dorm containing about 10 bottles of prescription medicine. She said it was for a skin issue. I wondered if that was true. Maybe she had another disorder or scary side effects from the medication. A few days later, I realized I had left a book and a binder in her room. I didn't care much about the book, but she messaged me asking me to come get it. I told her I needed to focus on my nursing training in my new room, but agreed to retrieve my things to avoid suspicion. My key card still worked, so I went in. She wasn't there, and I sighed in relief. I grabbed my belongings and turned to leave. As I turned, she was standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard her unlock it. I smiled, trying to stay calm. She didn't say anything at first. I walked past her to leave. Then she asked, "Where's your new room?" I told her it was on the first floor of the dorm wing. She asked which hall, and I lied. She asked what it was near. The stairs, the front, the nursing station, etc. I said I didn't remember, but she kept pressing. I lied again, saying it was near the stairs. I turned around and left, never seeing her again. I thought about telling her boyfriend, but I was too scared. I still think about it. Was I dreaming, hallucinating? I don't think so. But it couldn't have been anyone else. Only we had key cards. Maybe she was sleepwalking as a side effect of her medication. Or maybe she was planning something sinister. My mom thinks she was testing how close she could get to me before I woke up. And that one morning, she might have actually tried to choke me. I don't know. It's in the past now. And I hope she never had another roommate again. This incident occurred during my time at a hospital rotation. I attended nursing school and did my clinicals at St. Mary's from 2021 to 2023. It's not exactly known for its quiet nights. So a lot of students end up spending late nights in the hospital, especially in the break rooms or the old medical records wing that stays open 24/7. I've never been the type to stay out late myself, but this happened during my last year when I had no choice. I was taking an advanced pharmacology class, and our professor was notorious for loading us with massive assignments. The due date for one of the biggest projects was approaching, and I hadn't made as much progress as I should have. My laptop had been giving me issues, so I decided to use the computers in the old administrative wing of the hospital. That wing is a little isolated from the rest of the hospital. It's 3 stories tall, kind of old, and it always had this weird sterile silence to it, especially at night. But the computer room on the second floor was usually pretty empty after 9 p.m., so I figured it would be the best place to focus. That night, I got there around 10 and co. The hospital was already dead quiet, and when I stepped inside, I noticed right away how much colder it felt than outside. I swiped my staff ID, heard the beep, and the door unlocked. The whole place had an overwhelming odor of cleaning chemicals, which meant that I wouldn't bump into any of the cleaning staff as they had already done their rounds in this building. I went straight to the computer room, booted up one of the computers, and started working. For a while, it wasn't bad. The hum of the computer and the tapping of my keyboard filled the silence. I kept glancing at the clock in the corner of the screen, reminding myself that I'd leave before 1 a.m. But around 11:30, something weird happened. I was scrolling through some data when I heard the sound of a door slamming shut somewhere down the hallway. Not the front entrance. It came from further inside the old wing. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the air system or the janitor. But then I remembered the janitors had already come through, and by now they'd be long gone. I tried to ignore it and kept working. But then came footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps echoing from the hallway outside the computer room. They weren't rushed, and they weren't faint. Whoever it was, they were walking like they wanted to be heard. I froze in my chair, staring at the computer screen, hoping they just passed by. But instead, the steps stopped right outside the door. I could see through the little window in the door if I leaned back, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I just sat there holding my breath. After maybe 10 seconds, I heard the door handle being rattled. It wasn't like someone casually testing it. It was someone deliberately trying to scare me, like whoever it was wanted to open it but couldn't. My heart started pounding. The computer room doors locked automatically after a certain time, so I knew they shouldn't be able to just walk in, but the way they kept rattling the handle made me feel sick. After maybe 30 seconds of this, the sound stopped. The footsteps started again, slowly moving down the hall until they faded away. I sat there in silence, debating whether I should just pack up and leave. But my project was due the next morning, and a part of me thought that maybe it was just another staff member messing around. I tried convincing myself of that and went back to typing, but not even 10 minutes later I heard it again. Footsteps. Only this time, they weren't coming from the hallway. They were above me. The ceiling in that old wing has those thin hospital-grade panels, and you can sometimes hear the pipes when the heat kicks on. But this wasn't pipes. This was the distinct sound of someone crawling or dragging themselves directly above the tiles. I stared up, terrified as to what I would see. I could see one of the tiles shift slightly, just enough to know that weight was pressing down on it. Then came this slow creak like someone carefully lowering themselves, trying not to be heard. I had enough at this point. I yanked out my flash drive, shoved my notebook into my backpack, and sprinted towards the door. The second I stepped into the hallway, it was like I'd walked into a different world. The hall was dimly lit by those buzzing fluorescent lights, and all I could hear was the sound of my sneakers squeaking against the tiles. I walked fast, trying not to outright run. I got to the stairwell, shoved the door open, and started down. That's when I made the mistake of looking up. On the landing above me, just one floor up, there was a man. He wasn't a nurse, nor was he a doctor. He looked out of place, like his clothes were baggy and torn. His face half-shadowed, but I could see his mouth was hanging open like he was grinning really wide. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring down at me. I bolted. I flew down the stairs so fast I almost tripped. I slammed through the first floor door and sprinted for the front entrance of the wing. My ID card barely registered fast enough to unlock it, but once it clicked, I shoved it open and ran across the hospital campus without looking back. I didn't stop until I was inside my on-call dorm with the door locked behind me and my back pressed against the door as I tried to catch my breath. The next morning, I went back only because I had to turn in the project. When I walked into that old wing during daylight, it felt like a completely different place. But I noticed something that made my stomach drop. I saw one of the ceiling tiles was missing, the one directly above from where I'd been working, along with the one from the corner, the tile I saw moving. It was as though someone had been watching me work, then proceeded to rattle the door handle to deliberately mess with me. And when they found the door to be locked, they proceeded to climb back up into the ceiling and enter from there. I dread to think what their intention was if they entered that room before I ran. I think it's safe to say I'm going to buy a new laptop and in the future complete my assignments from the comfort of my own dorm. My name is Annabelle. I'm 20 years old from the UK, and this happened to me during my training at a hospital, which is what we call a clinical placement here in the UK. This was when I was 18. I'm about to tell you about the scariest day of my life. Sounds dramatic, I know, but you'll see why. So for context, my hospital had these lanyards with ID cards on them, and although anyone can walk into the main lobby, you can only go beyond the secured doors if you scan one of these IDs on a screen, which opens the door into the staff-only areas. The IDs have your face and name on them, but a lot of staff flip them around so you can't see their picture. You also need this to open up pretty much every secure door in the hospital other than for patient rooms. Also, this was a fairly newly built hospital. It was really small but looked bigger because the building was pretty large. A third of the building was a psychiatric wing, another third was a pediatric unit, and the last third was the main hospital. Had just started my clinical placement at this hospital, and I vividly remember everyone being told on the first day to make sure not to let anyone into the secure areas that we didn't know. The day that this incident happened, it was the second week of my placement. But this was actually only my second full day there, as I'd been feeling sick all week. I had a long shift in the geriatric ward all day, and it was about halfway through the day when this takes place, about 20 minutes after my lunch break. I remember drinking a lot of juice that I got from the hospital cafeteria at lunch because I had to finish it all before lunch break ended since we're not allowed drinks out on the ward, and I had nowhere to put it without it spilling. So, 20 minutes later, I really needed to use the bathroom. I asked my charge nurse if I could go quickly, and we're not usually allowed to go to the bathroom during shifts anyway, so she was pretty annoyed about this since we just had break. But she could see I really needed to go, so she reluctantly agreed. This is significant because at this point nobody else would really be walking around the secure staff areas. I never even really saw other nurses walking around often during shift hours. I left the ward and let myself through a set of double doors into the main corridor. And keep in mind, there was nobody in there at this point. I carried on walking into another large hallway with a second set of offices, used the bathroom, and let myself back into the main corridor again to head back to my ward. When I let myself back through the doors to the corridor, though, there was a man sitting on one of the benches. It wasn't weird for someone to be in there. Like I said, people aren't usually walking around during shift hours, but they still do. I mean, I was too at that time. I didn't know who it was that was sitting there. He was too old to be a student, so I assumed it was either a doctor or a visitor, and I just continued walking. But then he said, "Hey," and I let out a squeal because I'm quite a nervous, jumpy person anyway, and I wasn't expecting him to speak to me. I was pretty embarrassed, but he laughed and said, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." This is when I realized he actually had a lanyard on. So, at this point, I was assuming he was a doctor. What I realized, though, when I look back on this is that even though he had his lanyard on with the ID part was flipped over so that the side with your face and name on it was facing the back side of the card holder that's attached to the lanyard. Like I said earlier, staff would do that all the time at the hospital. The scanner would still work, so it wasn't a big deal, but definitely weird for a doctor to do. I didn't really pay attention to this detail at the time, though. I need some help getting some medical supplies out of my car. Do you mind coming out with me for just a sec? He asked me. I didn't hesitate to reply with, "Yeah, of course," because again, I just assumed this was a doctor. We walked out of the corridor in silence and into the lobby, and then out of the hospital building. And I kind of noticed he seemed a bit nervous, like doctors usually make small talk with you when you're walking somewhere with them. And he was saying nothing. And also he was moving his hands a lot. Like at one point he had his hands in his pockets, and then he'd take them out and kind of hold his hands together. I'm really shy and not too good in social situations, so I didn't make any attempts at small talk either. With the layout of the front of the hospital after we left the building, you've got about 50 or so meters, which is about 55 yards, to the car park, which you can't see, until you're right next to it because there's a bunch of bushes which obscure it. If you walk straight on without turning into the car park, you'll be off the hospital property. So, we were walking to the car park in silence, and then he suddenly says, "Yeah, my supplies are in the boot." That's what we call the trunk of a car in the UK. He said, "I have a few bags, so I just need you to help me carry a couple into the hospital." I said, "Yeah, that's fine." We got to the car park, and he said, "My car is the blue one down, at the end." And as we got a few meters from it, I could kind of see something in the back seat, and as we were getting closer to it, I realized there were at least 2 men hiding in the back seat. I froze, and instead of running away, I blanked, and I guess they saw that I could see them because the back door swung open. And all of a sudden, there was a man scrambling out of the car, and the man who I thought was a doctor grabbed my arm as I turned to run back to the hospital. This guy was pretty tall and large, by the way. And for context, I'm 5'2" and quite underweight, so I don't know how I managed it. A rush of adrenaline or whatever, but I used all the strength in my body to yank my arm out of his grip and start running back towards the hospital. I could hear multiple heavy footsteps running after me, but thank God they stopped pretty soon after I started running away because my hospital had big glass automatic doors and you have to just wait for them to open. And they definitely would have caught up to me if they kept going. I guess the fact that they were glass doors, though, would have been risky if there was someone walking by. Either way, though, I got into the lobby and ran straight into the open cafeteria, which was attached to the main hall, and I ran up to the person working at the cafeteria to tell her the situation. She calmed me down and came with me into the hospital to a doctor's office and called my parents and the police. There were security cameras in the parking lot, so they were caught and charged with attempted kidnapping. Also, turned out that man was able to enter the hospital because some staff member dropped their lanyard outside the building, and that's what he was using and why he flipped the ID over. I didn't go back to the hospital for a couple of weeks, and I'm still having therapy for this experience. But I felt writing this whole thing down and sharing my story would help me process things. This remains the scariest experience of my life.